In this channel, I try to bring you the best of the best mind in the world to discuss philosophy, science, intelligence, artificial intelligence, and even more. And my guest today is just such a scholar. His name is Steve Hsu. He's an American physicist. He received his bachelor degree from the California Institute of Technology, which is Caltech, at the age of 19, and he got the PhD from the University of California, Berkeley in 1991. According to Wikipedia, and this is a quote, in July 2012, Michigan State University named him Vice President for Research and Graduate Studies. At that time, Inside Higher Education and Lancet State Journal described the appointment as controversial. This is great, controversial, due to Hsu comments endorsing research using genetics modification to increase human intelligence, what we call superintelligence, and his blog post describing human race categorization as biologically valid. He also founded several startup companies. He has his great blog named Information Processing and the great podcast, which I highly recommend, Mainfold. So, Professor Steve Hsu, thank you so much for coming today. How are you?
I'm great, and it's a pleasure to be on your podcast.
It's my pleasure, believe me. So let's start in the beginning. In one of your latest interviews, you mentioned that you had, and again, this is your quote, high amplitude exposure to extremes, which I think is both true and fascinating observation. So first, what is high amplitude exposure to extremes? And B, why is it so important?
So if we specifically talk about cognitive ability, I had some very formative experiences. So when I was growing up in Iowa, which is, for your listeners, maybe you don't know where that is, that's the very middle of the US, and it's famous for growing corn and soybeans. It's an agricultural state. And my father
taught not in China. This is the most important thing.
Yes, not in China. No,
yes.
It's the most American of American places. And my father was a professor at the local state university there. And just by chance, our next door neighbors had a child who was, the term that we used at the time was mentally retarded. And I think today maybe you would say he had an intellectual disability. And he and I were about the same age, actually. He maybe was a year older than I am, but basically the same age. And we played together almost every day, both in our yards and also in the park, which was nearby our house. And so I knew him very well. And so I have to some degree, I think more insight into what it means to be on the far left tail of the intelligence distribution. So I have exposure to that in a very real way. And I want to say that his parents were very loving. They were very religious people, wonderful people. But they knew they had a burden because they always had to worry about my friend, Mark, how he would take care of himself the rest of his life. Because when they went, he could easily be swindled out of money. He could easily, drink too much and go to jail, which I think might have actually happened. But anyway, he was in for a tough life. And so they were aware of all that. And I could sense the kind of a sense of sadness. Like when I just saw them, I always felt maybe I could have been imagining this, but I don't think I was, that they realized that their son was going to have a very tough road. And they were older parents, so they were not going to be, they're gone now. And they were aware of all this. That's one end of the distribution. The other end is super intelligent people like yourself, but even also people like Richard Feynman, top theoretical physicist, young prodigies who had performed, very well in the International Math Olympiad competitions, things like this. So I've kind of seen the whole spectrum.
And in sport.
And in sport too, yes.
Sorry for interrupting you, but I think that the sport is also very important in the context of our discussion.
Yeah, so I was very interested in sports when I was a kid, and my brother was athletic, and we hung around not just with the brainy kids, but we also hung around with the athletes. And I happened to be a competitive swimmer from the age of about 7. And swimming is a very, shall we say, quantitative sport, because you don't interact with anybody really. You just jump in and you swim your time, and you can look and you can see, okay, what rank is my time in the state of Iowa? What rank is my time in the United States? what rank is my time at the Junior World Olympics, right? So you know immediately where you stand. There's no bullshitting. You can't bullshit, right? You can't say, oh, I had a bad start or this or that. You know, you just have to perform, and you can measure the performance very carefully. And my high school program was very storied program. In fact, we just had the 40th reunion of the state championship team in 1982 with our coach of that time. And it was a very moving reunion. So we had some top swimmers. We had swimmers who were at the All-American level. And even I think at some points in my career, I competed against people who later made the Olympic team. One of the top guys in my era of high school swimming in Iowa, not at my high school, but we competed against him, won an Olympic gold medal, I think, in Los Angeles. So in that field, I've also seen quite a spread from just ordinary people, below average athletes. Everybody knows some of those. And then, you know, slightly above average athletes like myself, and then really far talented athletes. And because obviously I have a kind of analytical mindset, I watched these other athletes in the weight room. So for example, not just how well can you swim, but how well can you lift weights? How strong are you? How fast are you? How explosive are you? So you can just see that there are extremes to all this, right? So there's no denying it. So I think in today's era, people want to say there are no differences, or maybe the only thing that differs between people is how hard they're willing to work or what environment they come from. But I think if you're a student of sports, you can see there are some hardwired genetic aspects of sports performance that really just can't. Yeah, which really can't.
So let me just recap, because I think it's very important. Now, one thing that we can learn from the left side of the curve is to be gratitude for what God gave us. I'm much smarter than my neighbor, therefore I'm going to conduct, I think, a better life. And even it's my moral obligation, since I have the tools, I have the capacity. But another thing that you got from this high amplitude exposure to extremes is the idea of correlation, which Galton and all the guys spoke about, that the idea that if you are good, very good at one thing, usually it correlates with other things in the same domain. Let's say sport. So I'm going to be very good in swimming, but it correlates with other disciplines in sport, or I'm good in math, but I'm going to be the best student in other domains. Am I right?
Yes. So it naturally, the question came to my mind already fairly early on in my life, this issue of correlation and whether different attributes of a person were positively correlated or negatively correlated or had zero correlation. So for example, I didn't really notice a correlation between how well you did in school and how fast you could run the 50-yard dash. Like I just never noticed any correlation, maybe slight anti-correlation, but I'm not sure, but definitely not a very strong positive correlation. On the other hand, I had this strange experience when I took, we had to take these mandatory standardized tests in Iowa in elementary school, and the university. And you
scored on the top of each one of them.
Yeah, so the University of Iowa has an educational school that produces these tests, and they're used to diagnose performance of kids and identify gifted kids or kids that need remedial help. And the weird thing that happened to me was that I think there were 4 or 5 sections of this test, and the ceiling was not that high. It was 99th percentile. But I remember getting my scores, and it was 99, 99, 99, 99. And at that point, I thought, wait, is there only a 1% chance that you get each of these 99s? Because if they're totally uncorrelated, I didn't think this in quite this sophisticated way when I was a kid, but the general idea was in my head. Can I really be 1 in 10 to the minus 8 people? That can't be right. And so maybe it's just that conditional on getting the first 99, it's much more likely that you get the other 99s. And this is related to what you already mentioned, which is the G factor, or the general factor of intelligence, which impacts your performance in all of these different kinds of tasks.
Okay, so with your permission, I want to go back to what you said about ranking, because I think in swimming, in sport, we have the ranking, in chess, we have ranking, in golf, we have ranking. But as Linda Gottfredson, which I think the official definition of intelligence belongs to her, she said smart people, usually smart people, have no way of knowing how smart they are, because there is no rank. And this somehow is transparent. So we don't have the rank of how smart we are until we got to the physics department and the bachelor degree and the second degree and all that. But what do you think about us don't have any way of knowing what is our intelligence rank until the SAT, for example?
Yes, so I think it's difficult. It's a much more complicated quantity to measure, and it's a multi-dimensional quantity. So I think people generally don't know exactly where they stand in the population. And all of this field of psychometrics was an attempt to measure statistically where people rank in the population. Like, are you kind of at a 1 in 100 level? Are you kind of at a 1 in 1,000 level? Are you kind of a 1 in 10 level? So real scientists spent, this field is pretty widespread. At any major university, there's probably at least a few researchers who work on this kind of thing. So people have been working on this for well over 100 years, but it's non-trivial. And so in the public sphere, people can still dispute whether there's any well-defined thing called intelligence. They can say, oh, this is just the test only measures being good at taking the test, doesn't have any carryover to other activities in life. And it's possible even for, quote, public intellectuals and intellectual leaders to maintain that that's the case. But empirically, it's not true. Empirically, one can predict how students are going to do in college or in their studies or even in the military based on what they score on these tests.
Okay, now, a few years ago, and I want to just, from what you just said, many people, and Nassim Nicola Taleb included, and he was one of the public intellectual personas that you mentioned, made the claim that IQ is important in the extreme left, okay? What is once called feeble-minded or mentally retarded. By the way, Alfred Binet, who originated this IQ test in France, the main or original purpose was to trace or to find the feeble-minded in order to help them. But as long as you are above average, above 110, 120, it just doesn't matter. Just work hard. Now, you met Richard Feynman, and there is a quote by Richard Feynman, which I put in the book. And I think that this is basically what it means. And what Richard Feynman says is the following. He said, can a regular person be able to imagine those things like I imagine them? And he referred to quantum mechanics. The answer is sure. I myself was a regular person who studied, I translated it from Hebrew. So there are no genius, no wonder man, okay? You need to learn and learn and learn. But my premise in the book is that Feynman was wrong. Feynman was a genius. And his mentor, Hans Bethe, said Feynman was a magician. And his autobiography, on his formal biography called The Genius. So it's not just that once you are above 120, it doesn't matter. Let me quote you. There are many physicists whose contributions I cannot imagine having made. So could you please elaborate on this one, on how different, how important it is to be in the far right or far right or far right?
So it is true that Feynman didn't believe in IQ tests or thought it was extremely hard to measure intelligence, and also thought that, at least he said this sometimes publicly. I don't know that how much he really believed it privately, but he would say things like, I'm only good at physics because I spend a lot of time thinking about physics and I put in a lot of work. And so in a way, he was elaborating a model where it's all due to your hard work and effort, and zero due to any, quote, hardwired or genetic predisposition. And I think he was not an expert in this field of study, psychometrics or behavior genetics. The evidence suggests the opposite, that genes contribute a lot to the ceiling level of your intellectual development. So the evidence is against him. We can go into that. When you talk about behavior in the far tail, so there's plenty of evidence that suggests that being on the far right in your ability to score on these tests makes it much more likely that you are going to that you're capable of making a big contribution in science or some intellectually difficult discipline. And one of the best examples I can give of a study like this was by a psychologist at Harvard named Anne Roe, R-O-E, which was done in the 50s. And this was a time when things were not as quote politically correct as they are now. So you can just go out and you could just go out and study things in a straightforward way.
This,
So
this was after the termites?
this was after the term. Well, the termite study was a longitudinal study, so it was
Yes,
running
for 30 years.
Yeah, it was running probably while Enro was doing her work, but
Because
her
I've never heard about Enro. So
oh,
please,
let me tell you. Yeah, let me tell you about it.
Do continue, please.
Yeah, so Enro was a psychologist, and she was interested in the title of her book, and she wrote many papers, published papers in academic journals, but there was also a book, and the title of the book was The Making of a Scientist. So her specialty was not psychometrics. Her focus was not psychometrics. Her focus was the life histories of scientists, like what makes someone a top scientist.
Life experience.
Yes. And so if you look at her book, only one chapter is about measurements of intelligence or cognitive ability. Everything else is about what was your childhood like? What was your dad like? What do you do in the morning? It was all these other things. But
how do you brush your teeth?
Yeah. But the interesting thing she did is that she selected something like 64 very prominent scientists who are typically in their 40s or 50s. So they already had really significant accomplishments. And a pretty good fraction of the people on her list either had later won the Nobel Prize, or, you know, if I mentioned the name to you, you would say that's a very famous person. To physicists, the dozen or so physicists that are on the list are all really famous people now. But they were not that famous when she interviewed them. But she selected these people because the way she selected them, she went to the professional societies and she said, well, give me a list of really top people in this age group, and I want to interview them and study them for my book. So that's what she did. She collaborated with a psychologist at Columbia who was a psychometrician and administered tests, very special tests, which measured verbal, spatial, and mathematical ability for all of these 64 people. And essentially all of them were off scale, which I'll define in a second, off scale in at least one of those three different domains. And many of them were off scale in all three. So, or extremely high on all three. And here by off scale, I mean like above the 1 in 10,000 level, or 1 in, you know, maybe even 100,000 level. So she did this at random. She selected these people at random. She didn't select them because she knew they did well on psychometric exams. She selected them because they had accomplished something significant in science. And there were psychologists, biologists, anthropologists, physicists. So there's quite over a broad range. So I think a reasonable inference from her work and from other studies, like the Terman study that you mentioned, and also another one called SMPY, which studied precocious kids, is that conditional on having a super high score on these kinds of tests, you are more likely to be able to make a significant contribution to civilization. And I think that for people to dispute that, they really have to dispute very numerous and sound scientific studies, which have been replicated many times. So I'm not sure what Taleb's real position is on this. I think when pressed, he merely says something like, well, it's a very noisy predictor, which means that even if the kid is really high on the test score, it doesn't mean he necessarily is going to do anything good, because he also has to have hard work and imagination and the right opportunities. But the probability that he's going to do it is much higher than someone who scores low on the test. And I don't think Taleb has ever contradicted that more specific statement about the utility of these tests. But of course, I have to admit, I don't follow Taleb, so I don't exactly know what he's saying.
No, I think it was one with, I don't remember his name, but there was a big dispute over this, again, intelligent thing. But again, it's very important that you mentioned conditional on those tests, because many people say, I don't know in football, but you have like many positions in football. We just know nothing about football, but many people say, okay, there is no correlation between your weight and being good at this position at football, but all those position players are above 120 kilograms. So many people can say, okay, once you are a physics professor, your IQ should be at least 140. Therefore, there is no correlation between your achievements and your IQ. But you say, no, even in the 140 and north and above and right, there is a major difference. One person with IQ of 160 can understand, can think in a way that is just impossible for one with 140 to think of. And let me just quote from one of your articles, Hans Bether, the Feynman teacher. I always thought von-Neumann brain indicated that he was from another species, an evolution beyond man. And Hans Bether wasn't a stupid man. He was in the far right. Probably he had like 160 or 170. And he said, wow, I think that von-Neumann is beyond evolution, beyond man. What do you think?
So I usually say John von Neumann, but I bet maybe you're pronouncing it the right way. I don't know. But this guy was famously brilliant. He made important contributions to fundamental mathematics, physics, nuclear weapons, computer science. So even the top people of his era, so Hans Bether was a Nobel Prize winner in physics, and even the people of his era all said this guy is way beyond us. And in fact, they joked that he was maybe a Martian pretending to be a human, and that him talking to them was like them talking to their children. So they would make.
I think that I read in one of your papers that you mentioned his name. Okay, I don't know if you said. I mean, this guy, and he just quoted like from Charles Dickens' Two Cities, just the whole the whole first chapter. Am I correct?
Yes. One of the unusual things about von Neumann that is recounted by many people who knew him, and he was a very famous public figure at the time in the 1950s. So one of the things that was stated about him many times was that he had some kind of very unusual memory and also very unusual ability to calculate numbers in his head. And so they said, if you asked him, could you tell me what the first chapter of A Tale of Two Cities is? He could just start saying it was the best of times, it was the worst of times, and he would just give you, and he could sometimes, I guess, had done this sometimes just looking at something once, and then he would close the book, and then they'd say, okay, can you recite it? And he would recite it. So he was very unusual in many respects, and also in his contributions to science and civilization. So it's an example of somebody who people often use him as an example of somebody who's really, really, truly off scale.
I'm afraid to mention Marie Gell-Mann because maybe I pronounce his name wrong, but regarding Marie Gell-Mann,
yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much. I'm sorry. Yeah. It was like he knew more and more. He knew everything that there is to know. He knew, and he knew more. There were so many people spoke about Marie Gell-Mann in a similar way to what people think. So again, if you're a physicist, and you have a 180, it means that you have capacity that you can understand the world in a much better, more complex way. This is basically the idea. So there is no limit to what can be achieved with intelligence.
Yes, I think that's fair. Now, I just want to caution the listener that when you give these numbers like 180 or 160 or 200, it's actually not true that the tests are very good. When you get into this far tail, the tests are not the greatest way to differentiate between ability.
Because already, you don't have many people there.
Already when you get to like 1 in 10,000 or 1 in 100,000 level, it's not clear the tests are really doing a great job in distinguishing talent at that level. But at least it's some indication that if somebody just blows away the test, there's some chance this guy really is off scale. So, but in the middle, where you're talking about people between the first percentile and the 99th percentile or 99.9th percentile, probably the tests are actually reasonably good at kind of somewhat able to rank order people. But with noise, I mean, obviously, and when people take the test more than once, sometimes the score does fluctuate a little bit. So, but anyway, the more important point that you raised, which is that this no limit to intelligence, that there could be something like superintelligence or AGI, artificial general intelligence, which goes way beyond what humans today can do. I think that's clearly true. And one of the things we've learned, I don't want to hijack the conversation, but one of the things we've learned from AI recently, large language models in which we try to instantiate in the structure of the neural net, which is the AI, we try to instantiate the structure of human knowledge. It turns out that humans are only working with roughly a few thousand, maybe 10,000 different primitive concepts. So that, even though I might talk about something like a cougar really conceptually is more like big mountain cat or big wild cat. And it's basically made out of more primitive concepts. People who are familiar with Chinese characters know this, because to start reading the newspaper as a kid, you only need a few thousand characters, and each character is itself a concept. So we know that the space in which humans are kind of trying to describe the world or make sense of the world, it's a very, in one sense, very finite dimensional space. We can almost characterize how many dimensions it has now. And the AIs are, when they're trained on human language, they naturally develop this kind of structure. So you could imagine, well, eventually we'll have computers that are able to operate in a 1 million dimensional conceptual space or 10 million dimensional conceptual space, and they will be able to talk amongst themselves about things which we cannot really understand. So it seems pretty clear that that's true.
And I think that we know it from AlphaGo Zero, where when you have like a very giant deep learning neural network model, it can like bypass 2,000 years of learning Go and playing Go and coming up with different strategies, different solutions in just several days of training the system. So this is like what we can extract from AlphaGo Zero is that it's not just that it is better than human being, it developed new strategies unknown to the people playing Go for the last 1,000 years.
Yes, this is a very important point that you're making, and something that really surprised the Go experts. So people in the West aren't necessarily that familiar with Go, but it's been played for thousands of years and at a serious level. What I mean by serious level is that in Japan or Korea or China, there would be actual schools, academies, where people would come and study the game and in a scholarly way almost, and compete to be the top player. So it's like chess, but some people would say it's deeper than chess. It's more complicated than chess in a certain sense, for sure. And it's even been studied much longer.
It is much more complicated than chess. I think chess has 1 to 10 to the 120, and Go has 10 to the 190. So it is much, much, much more complex than chess. And I think even Richard Feynman once said, I don't think that there will be ever a computer program can play Go, because it was so inconceivable that one can, control all the different scenarios in Go.
Yes, so you can see Feynman can occasionally be wrong as well. The interesting thing about Go is that it's been studied seriously for so long, and yet a number of beliefs that humans held at high confidence about whether in this situation one should make this move or whether this line of play could be successful turned out to be wrong. And the computer actually invented entirely new ways to play Go, which humans had not imagined even after thousands of years. So it's an example of superior intelligence at work in a sense.
Okay, now I think that I read in Early Hunting Human Intelligence, I don't sure, but I think that I read there that if you have it's very hard for you to discuss anything with any person that are more than 2 standard deviation below your IQ level. For example, if you are 130, if you try to speak with a person of 90, it will be very hard. So my question is, let's say that we have like those physics genius, like Sheldon Cooper from Big Bang Theory, and we know that he cannot communicate. But on the other end, we have Louis Terman and the termite, and he said, no, those people were absolutely fine in constructing social relationships. So what's your take on your ability, or a genius guy ability, to communicate with the normal people once you are very, very intelligent?
Well, first of all, I think among highly capable people, and this guy von Neumann we were talking about before is an example of this, people sometimes suspected he was kind of simulating normal human behavior, that if he needed to deal with some generals, or he needed to deal with his daughter, or he needed to deal with the plumber, he could simulate. He knew what he was supposed to say, and he knew how he was supposed to say it, which vocabulary, what's the right way to, communicate well. Not all super intelligent people either want to do that or are capable of doing that. So they can't simulate normal human behavior, but some people can. Now, I think this question of if say a leader is more than 2 standard deviations beyond his troops, he will have a tougher, it's less likely that he'll have good rapport with those troops. I think that's a general rule of thumb. It's a good rule of thumb. I think the real issue is the following, and I can illustrate it in a very vivid way, is that when you get out to the tail, you have available to you a bunch of concepts which are intrinsically G-loaded concepts. They're intrinsically difficult concepts, and it's not easy to explain those concepts to regular people. So to take an example, this whole field of quantum mechanics, which was invented 100 years ago now, probably accounts for a pretty good percentage of our GDP now. So it's in everything. It's in our, the quantum mechanical effects are important in the semiconductors, in your computer, in communications technology, all kinds of stuff. But probably only 0.1% of the population has any kind of decent understanding of quantum mechanics. Now you might say, well, if everybody has available to them a good understanding of quantum mechanics, why wouldn't they want to understand it if it is important to all the different things around them in their world? Well, the reason is because it's actually cognitively difficult. And so people just have a tough time mastering it, even though it's being used all around them. So now what happens for defensive people like Nicholas Taleb or some public intellectual who doesn't like the idea of intelligence, they'll just say, well, I could learn that if I wanted to, it's not really hard, or if anybody really wanted to understand quantum mechanics, they could. But I think those are just not true statements.
So you, as a physics teacher, as a physics professor, my point is that you cannot understand that some of your students cannot understand. You can, because you invested your whole life in this whole intelligent thing, but we hear many times, from our math professors, how couldn't you understand it? This is so simple. This is trivial. This is, it's just from here to here. What the big deal? And again, they cannot even imagine that something which is so obvious, so transparent, so smooth from A to B can be unreachable for the majority of the population.
I think for a lot of high IQ people, it's tough to imagine what the world looks like from people who are to ordinary people. I think that's true.
And again, Linda Gottfredson said, okay, you could find 2 pieces of information in a sport article. It is something that at least 10% of the population cannot do. Finding a place on the map is something that 7% of the population can do. And she teaches this in Harvard, and people say, no, you're kidding. You're kidding. I just don't believe you, because people think of themselves as normal. I think that this is the main idea. People say, okay, I'm normal and I can do it. Many people don't consider themselves geniuses.
Yeah, I think it's easy for the elites to think, oh, everybody thinks like us, and they can't imagine what somebody on the other end of the distribution thinks. It was valuable for me to have this neighbor who had an intellectual disability, because I could see that, if you tried to reason with him about something, he wasn't necessarily going to appreciate it the way a normal kid would appreciate it. And that sticks with you the rest of your life. You realize people cognitively can be very different and approach things completely differently.
Okay, now we are moving forward, and you said in one of your interviews that for many years, I think that I'm quoting you right, since geneticists lacked the proper mathematical tools like multivariable analysis, we couldn't correlate intelligence with genes. basically because intelligence is a complex trait that is affected by many different genes. So we can't say, oh, this gene code, this one. It's not like blue eyes, which is much, much simpler. And now that we have the mathematical tools, that we have physicists like yourself in many startup companies dealing precisely with this thing, we can correlate on multivariable analysis. So now, did I say it correctly? And could you please elaborate on this one? Because I think it's fascinating.
Yes. So in the early days of human genetics, before we could inexpensively read out someone's entire genetic code, obviously data was in short supply, and the systems we could study had to be very brute. They had to be very simple. So in other words, there's a mutation. If you have this mutation, you get Tay-Sachs. If you don't have the mutation, you don't get Tay-Sachs. And it's a single place where the change is happening. And that was the nature of genetics until, roughly 10, 15 years ago, when a lot more data became available because of sequencing technology. And then subsequent to that, better and better machine learning technology or mathematical technology became available to make use, to learn from the data that became available. So still today, like if you talk to a lot of older biologists, they still have this model of everything is controlled by a single gene. And they can't imagine what the model must look like if in fact there are 10,000 different loci spread over all of your chromosomes, which are affecting how tall are you, or how good is your brain in some sense. But that is what we've learned just in the last roughly 5 years. We've learned that this is how it actually works. Now, I think a lot of people, if they had come from physics or computer science or math, and they just imagine, they say, okay, we don't have the data available to us yet, but how must it work? How must it work? Well, they would have said there must be many, many switches affecting any really complex trait. It can't be that a single gene determines whether you're smart, dumb, or something like this. It's got to be not necessarily interaction, but the effects of lots of different things that are combining to determine that complex trait. And that's how it's turned out to be.
So, and this is one thing that you had a talk at Google, and you said, listen, Googlers, you are very smart. I want you to please come. And there is I think Chinese research that we want to take, we want to map very intelligent people, and we want to screen their DNA and say, okay, how correlate this DNA of a 140 guy with another DNA of a 150 girl? So we can again measure and correlate complex traits. Now, what have we learned so far? How you say it? Deterministic? No. I forgot that. How genes affected, how intelligence is affected by genes. And I think that you said in one of your papers that intelligence is affected by genes just like height.
Yes.
This is a very massive statement. Just like height. Wow.
So let me say it this way. There are very strong similarities between the genetic architecture of height and the genetic architecture of intelligence.
80%.
Yeah, so if you take two identical twins, so they have the same DNA, but you separate them and you raise them in two different families, okay? Now those families are different in subtle ways, but let's assume they're both good families. So they feed the kid enough food, they give the kid a chance to go to school, good families, but okay.
It's not suburban India and Beverly Hills. It's
right. There's no severe deprivation involved. So let's suppose they're both good environments. In both cases, what you'll find is the two twins, if you now let them grow up, so they're 30 years old and you measure them, they might differ in height on average by a couple of centimeters, okay? And it might differ in IQ by maybe 10 points or something, okay? So there's a small fluctuation, and that's to be expected for many reasons, but they had a different environments, et cetera, et cetera. So, but it seems like, and if you do the same experiment with people who share half their DNA, like two brothers, okay? Or you do it with somebody who shares 1/8 of their DNA or some smaller fraction, you get a result which just the similarity just decreases, almost linearly with the fraction of genes that they share. So this was known already, many, many years ago. The question then is, okay, what is the exact nature of the genetic architecture? Where are the places in the DNA that are specifically affecting height or specifically affecting intelligence? And that is where the progress has been made in the last 5 years, to the point where we know in both cases, there are tens of thousands, of order 10,000 different locations in the genome that affect your height. And similarly, these are different locations that affect your intelligence. In the case of height, we've mapped it out sufficiently well that we can predict, for people who grew up in healthy environments, we can predict their adult height plus or minus a few centimeters. Okay.
Just by screening of the DNA as embryos?
Already. So if say you just sent me a sample, like, I don't know, Roy, I don't know how tall you are, but
Just
suppose you.
185.
Oh, okay, you're taller than me. So
Yes, because you look very tall.
No, I'm only 183. So I guess I was 184 when I was younger. But anyway, so if you sent me your DNA and I just ran it through the code, it might predict this guy is 186 plus or minus 3 centimeters or something. Okay. So that's the level of accuracy of prediction that we can get to. And it's almost getting to the level of, like, if I see your twin, I predict how tall the other twin is, but it's not quite that good, but it's almost that good. Okay.
How could you predict my IQ test, given my DNA? So
in this case, there's still a very large uncertainty. I don't actually know the exact number. It's probably plus or minus 15, at least, yeah, probably like 15 points or something. But the way we describe it for intelligence, because it's still not as good, and I'll explain why it's not as good yet. We actually just describe it in terms of correlation. So maybe, unfortunately, this is probably not that intuitive for your listeners, but basically the correlation between the predicted IQ score and the actual IQ score is around 0.4, 0.35, 0.4. So it's enough.
When you say correlation, you mean R or R squared?
R.
Okay, so we need to multiply it. So it's going to be 16% of the variance is determined by,
maybe
the
just
DNA.
Maybe just under 20% of the variance can be predicted. So that's different. We know there's actually more genetic control, but the actual learned model, predictive model, is not good yet. And the reason is that we just don't have enough data. So in the case of height,
it's very easy. Just measure me.
Yeah, it's easy to get the phenotype, and consequently we have more good data to train on. And we can see that when we train on the available labeled data, so data where you have the genome and then you have a well-measured IQ score, there's just not enough of it. You can see the learning algorithms doing this, and it wants to keep going, but you run out of data. With height, you can see it going up, and it starts leveling off because we have enough data. Once you pass a few 100,000, maybe 500,000 people for height, it sort of levels off. But IQ is still doing this, and we just have less data. So I predict at the end of this, if you could give me, so of order 1 million, maybe 1 or 2 million people with well-measured IQ tests, and I could train on that, I would probably end up with an error of maybe 10 IQ points. So I could predict.
And again, you know nothing about the person beside his DNA, his genome. You know nothing about his age. You know nothing about his, I don't know, his education. How many books did he have when he grew up? Nothing.
Let me state it very precisely, okay? So in a replication test of this, so this is a whole pretty well-developed field now called polygenic prediction of complex traits. And there are, hundreds or thousands of different researchers around probably thousands of different researchers around the world who work on this now. Here's the way we would replicate the study. We would try to find a population of people that were not used in training. Preferably, maybe they even grew up on a different continent than the people used in training. But we make sure none of them, as far as we can tell, had some severe environmental deprivation, like they were not fed lead when they were little kids, or mercury or something, that they had a good, decent environment. They could be 30 years old or 50 years old, doesn't matter. And then we would take just their DNA. We would not take their IQ score. The other guy would hold that secret. And we would just take the DNA, and then we would make predictions for each of them. And then we would compute the correlation between the predicted value and the actual value. And that's where you get this 0.4 correlation of around 0.4. Now, I predict you'll get much better correlation after our training set sizes get much bigger, as happened for height.
Now, another very, I don't know if I want to say the word bad, but a very interesting moral ramification is that hypothetically, you could do this process for embryos in IVF. So nowadays, if we have like several eggs that are reproduced, I don't know, like fertile eggs that you need to put back in the mother, you want to pick the egg with the highest probabilities to get to grow there. But in the future, and it is maybe the near future, you could screen and you say, I want this fertile egg because I screen for intelligence. Therefore, this egg, this fertile egg, has much higher probability of an intelligent boy or a girl. Now, this is science fiction, because again, in the IVF, when we have several eggs, I want to pick the one with the highest probabilities to develop a healthy pregnancy. But in the near or far future, this could not be a science fiction anymore. Am I right?
What you said is correct, except the use of the word science fiction. So what you described is science fact now. It is actually possible to do today. So the company I co-founded, called Genomic Prediction, works with IVF clinics to do genetic testing. And from the embryo, a little biopsy is taken, sufficient that we can characterize the whole genome of the embryo. What is currently done is we compute health risks. So we can tell which embryos are outliers for breast cancer risk or diabetes risk, heart disease, but we only report back those health risks. We don't report back any prediction for height. We don't report back any prediction for cognitive ability. We don't report eye color, nothing like that. So it's possible to do today, but we do not do it by choice. We deliberately do not report.
But you report gender.
I think we do, but I think that, yeah, maybe we do. That's not, I think there are some places where we're not allowed to report gender, and obviously we don't in those places, but in general, yes, we would report gender.
And again, but I had a talk after read what you just said about, all this about this company. I spoke with my friend who is a doctor, and she said, but nowadays you can screen for like health risks, but sometimes the most important factor is how well do I think as a doctor this fertile egg will be transplanted again in the woman womb. I think that I'm saying it correctly, because again, I'm not familiar with the term.
Yeah, so let me explain that.
Okay,
so
please.
the kind of genetic testing that I'm describing, where you get polygenic risk predictions for breast cancer or heart disease, that's the most advanced thing. And our company is the only one that can do it right now. The more basic kind of genetic testing, but which is very widespread. So maybe 100% in Israel. In the US, it's 60 or 70% of all IVF embryos are tested using this basic method. In the basic method, they're just checking to see, is there some problem with the chromosome structure? So that's a much grosser, bigger problem than trying to measure in detail the genetic polygenic risks. So that problem, that condition is called aneuploidy. Aneuploidy means you have an abnormal chromosome structure or number of chromosomes, okay? So aneuploidy testing is super common, and the same biopsy that you take for aneuploidy testing suffices, can be used by us to compute all these other scores, okay? Now, it turns out aneuploidy is very important for whether the embryo will implant successfully, so that you actually get a pregnancy. Aneuploid embryos generally will not implant successfully, or they'll implant and then you'll have a miscarriage or something. So for the number one KPI, performance indicator for the clinic, which is there a healthy pregnancy that ends up with a baby? This more primitive kind of aneuploidy testing is the most important thing. Now, it turns out, just a little plug for our company, because we get so much more information about the genome of each embryo, our aneuploidy prediction is much more accurate than our competitors, the existing methodology. And so clinics that use our technology, they end up with substantially higher pregnancy success rates because they're more accurately determining whether there's a problem with a given embryo and which one should be implanted. But that is the most important thing today in IVF, is trying to get a successful pregnancy, successful implantation.
Oh, thank you so much. So now I know what she was talking about, and now I know what you're talking about. And this is basically, again, this is how fine or how accurate you want to be. And this is great. But you just gave me a method to construct, to build, to replicate, to make super intelligent babies. Just make a lot of IVF, a lot of embryos, and just screen out for the one with 3 standard deviation, because once in a while you will get something like this: 4 standard deviation, 5 standard deviation, which leads to an article that you wrote 8 years ago: super intelligent humans are coming. So again, why don't we do it? Or maybe in China, they're already doing it.
Well, I think at the moment, nobody's doing it. Already one could start to do things like this, okay? And here's an interesting fact, which I only learned myself relatively recently, but it is a little bit shocking to me. So some of the people that we work with, families that are doing IVF, are using donor eggs. So that means maybe the wife is past the point where she's producing viable eggs and they need to get the eggs from a donor. And oftentimes the donor is much younger. It's like she could be like a 20-year-old college student or something. And when the hormonal stimulation that you use in IVF to cause the egg to increase egg production, when that's done on a young, healthy woman, sometimes they get 60 or 100 eggs in one shot. Okay, so these high net worth people, super high net worth people, could select their embryo possibly from 100 if they wanted. And now the main limitation then is the quality of the prediction. So if we got the correlation up from 0.3 or 0.4 up to 0.6 or more, then obviously they could tell with much better accuracy which ones are the, are the positive outliers for whatever trait they're talking about. In this case, we're talking hypothetically about intelligence, although I want to say again, we don't do this. But if someone had 100 embryos, and they had a somewhat better predictor, which is entirely possible technologically, it's just a matter of getting the data.
And you need to choose just 1 or 2.
Yeah, say you choose 2 or 3, and out of 100, yeah, you could get a substantial gain. So, and even further in the future, now I am talking about science fiction. Up till now, I've not been talking about science fiction. If we improve our editing technologies, we could deliberately edit, instead of having to select 1 out of 100 embryos, we could just edit the DNA in the embryo in such a way as to pump up.
Okay, no. Without editing, I want to just say that once in a while you get 3 or 4 standard deviation to the right. And I think is in one of your conversation, I think with Stephen Molyneux, you said you mentioned Shaquille O'Neal, or Shaq, as you call him,
yeah.
that and I think that your example was that like 30 years ago, this height was so rare in US basketball players, but nowadays it is much more common. Could you please elaborate on this example with the context of, yes, sometimes, and it will happen more often than not, we will get false standard deviation.
Yeah, so I think what's unique about Shaquille O'Neal is not just his height. So he's just over 7 feet tall, but it's that his body proportions are more like an athletic person of normal height, of who's say 6 feet tall. So what's weird about him is that unlike, I don't know if you're a big basketball fan, but like Kareem Abdul-Jabbar or Patrick Ewing, or those guys were very skinny, tall people. Shaq looked like he could play football, but he was 7 feet tall, okay? Or he could play rugby, but he was 7 feet tall. And so they could not guard him. So if he were trying to make moves near the basket, nobody could stop him from making his moves because he was just so physically explosive and strong and just enormous. So that is still rare in the NBA. There's actually nobody in the NBA quite like Shaq even today. However, the point is that if one were selecting for those kinds of traits, one could eventually increase drastically the number of people in the population or the fraction of the population that has those capabilities. And it's entirely possible. So instead of one von Neumann in the mid 20th century, you could have 1,000 of them walking around working.
And if you don't believe me, look at that. Look at those chickens.
Yes.
And those chickens. So again, for our podcast viewers, please watch YouTube. But in 1957, the average chicken, laying egg chicken, weighed 905 grams. In 78, the average chicken laid weight 1,800 grams, and in 2005, the average chicken, God mercy their soul, weighed 4,200 grams. So again,
I want to say that picture comes from a scientific paper written by scientists who study agricultural breeding of animals. And for this paper, they raised these chickens in exactly the same environment, gave them the exact same food, and they're exactly the same age, but they come from different breeds, different genetic strains of chicken. Now, animal breeding is a very advanced field now, to the point where genetics, the same technologies we're talking about here, up till now in the conversation, those are widely used in cattle breeding, chicken breeding, corn breeding, soybean breeding. So they genotype the individual animal, and they'll often use the sperm from the top bull to inseminate, thousands and thousands of female cows to get super performing milk cows or beef cows. So we know that the range of possibilities is huge, that you can take that skinny looking chicken and make it into the Shaquille O'Neal chicken by just changing the genetic structure. And if you look at the mathematics of it, intelligence is the same and human height is the same. So probably you could have a group of people where all the males in that group look like Shaq, and you could, or even taller, and you could have a group where everybody's like an Einstein, and that would be just phenomenal. It would be unimaginable for normal humans to think about.
Which leads me, and please don't get insulted, to one article that you mentioned in Twitter and said the IQ trap, how the study of genetics could transform education. And there is a great book, G's for Genes. By the way, Robert Plumin is going to be here in 2 days, but he's going to discuss his new book. Now, the study of genes, says Phil Ball, the study of genes which affect intelligence could revolutionize education, but haunted by the aspect of eugenics, the science risk being lost in a political battle. And I would say, with all due respect, Steve, that you contribute many to these flames, because when we have this polygenics factor, when we can screen for intelligence, when you say to me, listen, the things that you just mentioned, this is not science fiction, this is true, valid science, in a registered company in the US, you understand why people are so afraid, why people are so intimidated from the word eugenics after the Holocaust. And this is, I think, explained in some degree the scandal of University of Michigan, when people said, yes, but Steve Hsu is a bad man. He's not a bad man, and he's talking valid science, but there is valid science as a very massive moral implications that that your answer right now is, yes, but we don't do it. We can do it, but we don't do it.
Yeah, so that's a huge...
I'm sorry if I put a burden on you, but I think that this is a very important question to address, no?
Yeah, let's spend some time talking about it. So first of all, the reason we don't allow selection and don't report prediction of these more controversial traits like intelligence is because of this controversy. And we want society to discuss these things, to understand the science, and then come to a conclusion about what's acceptable, what's not acceptable for an IVF clinic to do. So that's our goal. That's why whenever someone asks me to come on their show to discuss this, I always say yes. Now, you're obviously a very intelligent and enlightened person on this subject, but sometimes the people inviting me are not. But I still go on the show because I think we need to inform the public. It's as if we invented atomic weapons, but nobody knew how the atomic weapons worked or what their effects would be. But we need to formulate national strategy about these things. So that's why it's important to have these conversations. Now, regarding the term eugenics, technically that term, I think in Greek just means good genes or good reproduction.
Better yourself.
Yeah, and in Chinese, the characters which are used to represent the term eugenics have a totally positive connotation among the Chinese public. If they see those terms, they mean, oh, healthy birth, good, healthy family. That's what they think of, okay?
By the way, if you go in Israel, if you want to donate your sperm, you need an SAT of 700 and above. So again, we know what eugenics is. I come from a the Jewish mother looking at your girlfriend saying, no, she's not for you. This is positive eugenics. Okay? I want better genes for my boy. Chinese and Jews are very much alike in this concept of eugenics. I want the best genes for my boy. I want the best gene for my girls. Nevertheless, we had Auschwitz and we have concentration camps. So what can we do with eugenic as a good concept, but having very bad history?
Yeah, so I want to elaborate on this, and I'm glad to be talking to an Israeli. Actually, you're not the first Israeli I've discussed this with. There's a very famous statistical geneticist named Shai Carmi at Hebrew University, and I suggest you interview him. He's also a former physicist, actually. So I want to say this. Obviously, the Holocaust, it's a singular event, and I've never said this publicly, but when I was growing up as a kid, I read many books about the Holocaust. I was almost like a Holocaust scholar in the sense that I read everything about it. And it affected me deeply because I was growing up as an Asian American, so I was a little bit of an outsider, even though I grew up in a very nice town with wonderful people. But I always felt like, wow, if the Germans could do this to this minority group that had lived with them for so long, it could happen to me. And so it affected me a lot. I've thought long and hard about the Holocaust and how terrible it was, and hope nothing like that ever happens again. Now, that's a different kind of eugenics where you say to somebody, I don't like your genes, and I'm going to do something to you against your will because of your genes. And I am totally against that. Obviously, I'm totally against that. That's a little bit different from the family has 10 embryos. They're going to use one and maybe donate the rest to science. I might as well help them select the one which furthers their goals, okay? Maybe that can be healthy or have a good life. Now, here's the danger, the slippery slope. And again, to anybody who's my critic, I want to emphasize I'm fully aware of this slippery slope. Once you start judging people by their DNA, because we're ranking one of those embryos above the other 9. Once you start that, there's a danger that you are dehumanizing people based on their DNA. I
But
understand
you
that.
use the word better. This embryo or these genes are better than these genes. This is
Yes,
the word. You must use the word better in order to rank.
yes. Now, I think in this one situation where it's an aspect of IVF that you tend to overproduce embryos, and it's within the family, and they were going to not use the other 9 anyway, I feel like ethically, if you study it carefully, it's not wrong. Now, my experience with my neighbor growing up allows me to realize that somebody who isn't maybe intellectually gifted is still a real human being, still has feelings, is still important, needs to be respected, needs to have full human rights. So I never want to get to that situation where someone says, hey, you have crappy genes, I'm taking away your human rights. I think that is evil and should never be done. But I think these kinds of conversations are necessary for people to understand what, the distinction between saying your human rights derive from your being a human, from your being able to feel emotion, to feel pain, to feel joy. That's what your human rights derive from, not from the color of your skin, not from having good variants for intelligence. Okay, that's not what makes you human. It's the other things, and we all have that, and we should all have basic human rights. So that's my view of the ethical quandary here that we're living. Yeah, go ahead.
Let me tackle you, or basically the word I'm usually using is attacked, but attacked is a very powerful word in American English. So I want to attack 2 things that you just mentioned. One is your feeble-minded neighbor is basically, and you said it in our conversation and in other conversation as well, is part of what made Steve Hsu. And this was a very important factor. Your dad library card and your feeble-minded neighbor was 2 extremes, which made you so interested in all those psychometry. And this is just one thing. So I can go with the religious things that God put all sorts of people on earth, including the feeble-minded, so we could learn something. I bet that you are much more sensible or much more sensitive to your students, to your spouse, to your children, based on your very important experience with your neighbor. And this is something that screening for feeble-minded embryos will take away from society. This is one thing. Another thing, which is not going in this moral direction, is when I'm not referring to you, Steve, but when we society play with genes, we don't know what will be at the end of the road. Maybe this gene, mixture has something that will be good in the next COVID pandemic, that if we start to manipulate and add it, we will be much less immune to the next pandemic. So those are 2, I think, very important questions that if we start to manipulate, we can lose 2 very important things.
Yeah, so the way I would rephrase what you just said is that maybe it's important to have people who are more limited around so that we can appreciate the diversity of what humans are like. And we don't want to just go to this limit where everyone is a super genius with a brain like von Neumann and a body like Shaquille O'Neal. Maybe we don't want to go there. And I don't think we will go there, because when we talk to IVF families, some are really focused, maybe if they're Jewish or Chinese, they're really focused on the kid being smart. But plenty of parents actually don't care about that. They want their kid to be the quarterback of the football team, or just avoid the breast cancer that ravaged their family. So there's a diversity of what people want. So I don't think that because of diversity of preferences, we're not necessarily going to end up with a monoculture in terms of genetics. In terms of unforeseen outcomes from, say, trying to get a healthier kid, but you by accident make them less healthy in some other way or less resistant to disease, that's something that is a more kind of direct scientific question of, like, we need to study very carefully that we're not heading in that direction. And So there are papers we published recently, this is getting into some technical details, on something called pleiotropy, which is the question of whether a single genetic variant here is affecting multiple different traits, and maybe it's good for these traits and maybe it's bad for this trait. We are carefully studying that. And the interesting thing we find is that for any given complex trait, the specific loci in the genome that affect that trait tend to be disjoint. They tend to be different from the ones, mostly different from the ones that—
Just a second. My wife is screaming. Just a second.
Everything good?
Yes, everything is good. Oh,
okay. So I was just saying that this concept of pleiotropy, that you can't improve one trait without maybe doing something bad somewhere else, that doesn't look like it's entirely true. And the evidence seems to be against it. And in fact, what we're finding is that the genetic loci that affect one trait tend to be in different places than the ones that affect the other trait mostly. So, or often we find for health, we find that there's almost a general factor for health, kind of like the G factor of intelligence, that there's a kind of overall health thing which expresses that different disease risks are themselves positively correlated. So when I reduce your risk of one thing, I'm also, on average, reducing your risk of other things. So,
you know, it's very interesting what you just said, because Nicholas Wade in Troublesome Inheritance said about, you know, Ashkenazi Jews being much disproportionately smart, and he said that one of the reasons could be Mendelian diseases, that Ashkenazi Jews suffer in much higher rate than Sephardic Jews. So again, the same trait that causes Mendelian diseases is also the same gene, or the same gene pool that got them to be smarter. So some trait can cause one bad thing and one good thing.
It is possible that that is true. So this is I don't want to say controversial, it's just not settled science. It could be that a particular population gets a boost from some single change of large effect. And that single change of large effect, maybe, for example, it could elevate your intelligence but also put you at higher risk for some disease. And that's possible, that's true. I don't have an opinion because the data is not completely definitive on this. When you talk about polygenic contributions, so not one particular locus that has a huge effect, but 10,000 different ones that have small effects. As we locate those 10,000, we can ask, well, how much overlap is there between the 10,000 affecting height and the 10,000 affecting intelligence and the 3,000 affecting heart disease and the 2,000 affecting diabetes risk? And we actually find very little overlap. So it's, again, you wouldn't conclude any of this until you actually did detailed studies of the predictors and using lots of data and things like this. But that, we just published a paper on this. So that's the current state of our understanding.
So now, as being the vice president of University of Michigan for Studies, and what can you tell me, or what action could we derive from this talk regarding admission of different ethnicities, okay? Because we had like this Boston lawsuit of American Asian students who score approximately 105, and they said, okay, in the SAT, you ignore it. You don't, we are not get accepted to Harvard or the Ivy League according to our SAT, because if we were, all Harvard or all the Ivy League were filled up with Asian students. So, and on the other hand, we see that Black students get accepted in many American universities, not based on their SAT, but based on some unmeasurable metrics, like how you contribute to society. How do you think now, A, do you see it happen in your Michigan State University? And B, how do you think that in the long run it's going to affect what university is meant to do, and like educate the next generation researchers?
So there's two separate issues here which are relevant to what you're describing. So one is, what methods should the university use to admit students? And traditionally, universities have tried to get the best students, so the ones who are likely to be successful at their university and maybe in the more difficult majors. Okay, so one is just how should we conduct admissions? And admissions involves, quote, measurements on the students. So like, how well did they do on this test in high school? What was their high school grade point average? What other things did they do while they were students? Those are the traditional inputs to predict performance at the university. Now, for whatever reason, there are some subpopulations. It could be Asian Americans, it could be Jewish Americans. They tend to do very well in school. And it could be because the parents really push them and they have a culture of learning. And these two examples, they've been literate for thousands of years, long before other groups. It could also have something to do with genetics, but we don't really know. And the second thing that I was going to mention is genetics of group differences. So in other words, could it be that one population defined as Sicilians is for genetic reasons shorter than another group of people defined as Swedes? Okay, that's a group difference. And it could be because the height elevating alleles are little bit less common in the Sicilians and a little bit more common among the Swedes. So it's a possibility. Okay.
From all the IQ researchers I had on the show, and I had many, including Richard Heyer and Charles Mary and Garrett Jones and many others, and Russell Warren, the only IQ researcher, which is not IQ researcher, by the way, Richard Nisbet, said that there is no genetic basis for the black-white 15 points IQ gap in the US. No, yeah. He was just the only one. And he said, I have never conducted an IQ test for anyone. So he's not an IQ researcher, and he claimed it for himself. Yeah. I'm not an IQ researcher. No one beside him, no one says that there is no part of genetic basis for this gap.
Yeah, let me say it this way, because this is a very controversial topic and you have to speak very carefully about it. So at the testing level, there are different outcomes. So in other words, average, Asian American kid might score higher on the SAT than the average white kid or the average Hispanic kid or Black kid. The causality of that is what's in question. So no one who is serious is disputing that these score differences or even grade point average differences exist typically within schools. Now, there could be some school where it's reversed or for some reason things are just different. But on average, that's a kind of generic pattern, and nobody disputes that pattern exists. And that's why we have things like affirmative action, because we want to have more Black students on campus, even though maybe on average, for whatever reason, I'm not taking a position on the reason, for whatever reason, they don't do as well on the SAT, or their high school grades aren't as good. Maybe just for economic reasons or environmental reasons. Now, the question of what is the cause is the tricky one. Is it due to, like this example I gave you, that people in Sicily might not have quite as many genetic variants that make you taller as people in Sweden? Because the observed difference in height between Southern Europe and Northern Europe is about one population standard deviation.
I can swallow this explanation, since height is not that important feature in Western modern society. But I cannot swallow this explanation, although I think it is right, since intelligence is one of the most, if not the most important factor in modern Western society. Therefore, I don't care about height. Who cares? But I care about intelligence. This is why this is so inflammatory.
Yes, I completely agree with what you said. Now, but I'm just going over the basic science here. So there is some evidence, and this is again disputed by researchers, but there's some evidence that this difference effectively in polygenic score between Northern Europe and Southern Europe is really there, and is at least partially responsible for the fact that in the north of Europe, the average male is about 3 inches taller, 2 or 3 inches taller than in the south of Europe. Okay, so that's an observed group difference. There are at least some researchers who say it's partially caused by genetic differences, inherited differences. And furthermore, the evolutionary studies suggest that difference arose in only 5-10,000 years. Okay, but because of some difference in the, some environmental factor selected more for height or against height in these different regions. Okay, so that's the thing we can talk about without steam coming out of our heads or people attacking us on the internet. Okay, if I change the word height to intelligence, then suddenly the whole discussion is off limits. The only respectable thing you can say is that there's no way measured differences between populations could be due to genetics. As a scientist, you notice several times in our discussion, I said, I don't know the answer because the evidence is not strong enough for me to come to any strong conclusion. So it should be, at least among scientists, a completely respectable position to say, I don't know. I don't know the answer. We need to do more studies. We need much better data. And in particular, if it's a very inflammatory hypothesis, we really need to be careful. We don't just want to speculate about stuff.
Let me tell you a story. Let me tell you a story that Garrett Jones told me about James Flynn. James Flynn, the originator of the Flynn effect. And James Flynn, before he died, wanted to conduct a very big study to prove for once and for all that the IQ gap, the black-white IQ gap, is due to environmental causes only. And he was looking for scholars in the US to participate in this giant grant that he was applying for. And he found none that agreed to participate. And he said that the reason he didn't find any in the US is all the scholars he wanted to cooperate with were afraid deep inside their heart that, that this grant, that this research will find that there is also a genetic component to this gap, and they didn't want to take part on this. So he said, this is why I think none of the US researchers wants to cooperate with me. This is a very interesting story, and Garrett Jones told me this story.
So I think as a sociological observation about scientists in the US, it seems accurate to me. I think if my grad student wanted to participate in that study, I would say, think twice, because this is really going to impact your career. Even for participating in the study, let alone what the study finds, you'll be attacked. It's an unfortunate situation because, just based on the conversation, this very enjoyable conversation we've been having, it's clear that some of us think intelligence is a super important scientific topic, regardless of race and ethnicity, all these other things. We could be talking about the intelligence of computers, AGI, but it is really a central thing for the advancement of human civilization. So it's too bad that we can't study this. I understand that some people just say it's even immoral to think about studying these things. I don't necessarily agree with that. I do think that, let's just say hypothetically, let me give you a hypothetical. Let's suppose there's a population that has much higher rates of breast cancer than everybody else. And let's say we really want to fix this problem because it's really devastating. A lot of the women in this population die very young when they're still mothers and young mothers, and we just don't want this to happen anymore. And suppose I say, well, we need to understand this. We need to understand what is the genetics that's causing this. And suppose somebody comes along and says, I propose the government give the women in this population that has elevated breast cancer risk, we give them extra funding so that when they have children, we can select embryos for them that have normal breast cancer risk. And we'll break the chain. In even one generation, we'll break the chain in that subpopulation so that every subsequent generation born will have the same risk as the rest of the population for breast cancer. Who would criticize that? Who would say this is the wrong thing to do? Okay.
Wow, now, this is a very interesting Gedanken experiment. This is a very, wow, I've never thought about it.
Who would say don't do that? Who would say don't do the research necessary so that you can implement this program. Who would say that? No one would. Everyone would say, of course. They might say, oh, I have a higher priority. We should fix the drinking water problem first, or we have a bigger problem with climate we need to solve first. They might say it's lower on the list of priorities for society, but they would never say this is the wrong thing to do, or it's a bad, in absolute sense, bad use of societal resources. So if there is a subpopulation that has a problem, let's suppose you find that in the rural South of the United States, white children have lower polygenic scores for intelligence, and they've been stuck in poverty for generations. Let's suppose you find that. Are you going to tell me we should not try to figure out the cause of that it is polygenic in nature, and that we shouldn't try to fix it? I don't think you would say that, right? So just the scientific study of it is important. Now, you may study it and say there's no problem. These white children grew up in the rural South. They're poor because their families, they do poorly in school because their families are poor. It has nothing to do with genes. But surely you need rigorous studies to figure that out. And if you find the opposite, that they're disadvantaged because of their genes, I would say as a progressive, government should spend some money to fix their problem if they opt in. I would not compel them to participate in this program or the breast cancer risk reduction program, but if they want it, I think it's moral for us to do it for them.
I must tell you, I think that being a progressive and knowing all the things that you know about intelligence put you in a very discomfort situation. Wow. It's like you cannot be progressive. You cannot think that if you know, I think that Helmut Nyborg, I think he was a communist, and he was a scholar who found that the mean IQ for men is like 3 points higher than the mean IQ for women. And he said, I was a communist, and I was very left-oriented, and my PhD advisor told me, just do a thesis about crime and genetics. And he said, wow, it flipped me. He knew what I'm going to find. He knew what I'm going to find, and it flipped me. So it's very hard to be progressive and knowing what you know. Yes?
I understand your point, but you'll notice that the hypothetical I gave you was a kind of progressivism which is based in reality. So of course I might say, hey, government's going to do this very inefficiently. You know, there are all kinds of reasons why you wouldn't want government to try to solve a heritable breast cancer problem for this subpopulation. But the basic principle that, okay, this is a progressivism which could work, like reducing mercury levels or lead levels in the environment, like that could actually work, like the science is actually sound, as opposed to like rehabilitating criminals or something. Maybe you can be convinced that doesn't really work. This is one that you could be convinced, even if you're very strongly believe in heritability of intelligence and stuff like that, you could believe it could work. And then maybe you could support it. Because the ultimate goals of helping people who need help, I don't think that's a left-right distinction. It's just really, how confident are you that government could do this? How confident are you that we could be effective in doing it? Those are separate questions, I think.
Let me give you another trajectory that you can go. Let's say that you have either two options. It's either genes or culture. And many people say that what Jews and American Asian has is the culture of learning, the culture. Now, my daughter is watching like K-pop, many K-pop, and there is like many YouTube videos. Now, American women and Asian Korean women, okay? You just study for 18 hours straight. So it's it's a different culture that make learning and education something of very high importance. And what you think will be achievable, will be solvable in 10 years. How can we solve culture problem? How can we change culture? Or how can we manipulate genes? It seems that if it is all about genes, our ability to modify, to change, to edit, to cure gene diseases is much more than our ability to modify the culture of the Black community in the US, which is something that we don't know how to start thinking of. So it might be even better to think, yes, it is genes, therefore it is solvable because we don't know how to solve culture problems.
Well, I agree with you. It's very difficult to engineer someone's culture. It's much harder to engineer their culture than to have them voluntarily come in the clinic and say, yes, can you make sure the embryo you implant is the one with the lowest breast cancer risk or the lowest, mental retardation, intellectual disability risk or something. So I agree with you. Yeah. The thing about science, the thing about the power of semiconductors and all these things is engineering is that once you get it down, you can really do it, which is why it's so frustrating that this thing I said to you, which is that the reason our IQ predictors, intelligence predictors are not as good as our height predictors is simply because nobody wants to fund, just as Flynn discovered, nobody wants to fund the research to collect the data that would allow us to build these good intelligence predictors.
And like Richard Heyer told me, no one wants to find a cognitive difference between men and women, which can be very important since, I don't know, Alzheimer is developed differently for men and women since their brain is different. And like I wrote in the last chapter of my book, The Dark Side of Intelligence, explaining eugenics and everything, if you take God out of the equation, so there is no way but to rank, say, okay, this one is better, therefore I take this embryo. But if you put God back in the equation, you say, okay, your value as a human being is transcendental, is more than what you can give to society. And I think that it is not by chance that all eugenic movements were secular by nature, because if you take God out of the equation, there is nothing transcendental to compare. And there are much more contributing people and much less contributing people. And again, the first people to get killed in the Nazi concentration camps were the feeble German, the German feeble-minded. So again, this is my 2 cents for this intelligence research idea. What do you think?
I agree with you that religion, gives you a completely different perspective on all these things. And one that's underemphasized, I think, in the discourse is, what a Buddhist or a Hindu would say. So if you believe that my body is just the vessel of some transcendent thing, what do I care whether I have this
very good, yes.
I'm going to have an infinite number of lives, right? And be cycled through. So why get so upset about it? Why? So, and I don't discount those things. So like scientists who say they're sure there's no God or there's nothing beyond what we can see and measure in our laboratories, I think they have a kind of hubris, which is not completely warranted either. So I respect all of those perspectives. And again, this slippery slope that we talked about, this too much emphasis on the mechanical. I'm a molecular machine. I want to have the best molecular machine. That molecular machine is a little bit defective. Let's just get rid of it. That's a slippery slope, right? So that
definitely,
and we have to fight that. We have to retain our humanistic values, even as we try to understand the rules of our universe and the rules of our biology.
Steve Hsu, thank you so much for this conversation. It just blew my mind. Like with all of my guests, I would like to ask you 2 questions. One, could you name a book that you read in the last 5 to 10 years that really changed your mind change your perspective about the world? Just one book that changed your perspective.
I'll give one that really changed my perspective a lot. And I interviewed this guy, and you should interview him too. His name is Greg Clark. He's an economic historian, and he has very carefully studied the dynamics of social class. Most of his data is from England, but there are other data sets now. And what's interesting is that if you read these novels by Jane Austen, is that him? No, that's a different Gregory. This is a more famous Gregory Clark. The one that I mentioned is the professor. Now maybe type in Clark UC Davis. He's a professor at UC Davis.
UC.
UC, yeah.
UC. Okay. Gregory Clark. Oh, this one. Okay.
So for people are fascinated by class and how some families, become high status and others are stuck at low status. And he spent a lot of time looking empirically at this data and found really surprising results about the persistence of class over time, that families that were high status in the society hundreds of years ago tend to still be high status today. And if you read these novels, I don't read them, but my wife does and my daughter does. And so I'm forced to watch movies about based on Jane Austen stories. And if you look at the exquisite attention to matchmaking, like who marries whom, and the class relationships and who has the right character and potential, maybe this is done in Jewish families too, that plays a big role in the persistence of class over time. And one of the things Clark kind of predicted, when you look at his empirical data and you say, how could this be? How could class be this persistent? And if you do some calculations in using genetics, a theory from genetics, you realize, wow, there has to be a high degree of what is called assortative mating. So men who are above average have to consistently marry women who are above average, and kind of a little bit vice versa, in order to keep these things stable. So there was an implicit prediction in his empirical results, which suggested there had to be a high degree of assortative mating at a genetic level in order for his results to be consistent with what we know about genetics. And so many years later, 10 years on from when he wrote his first papers on this subject, the UK Biobank actually allowed us to calculate the degree of assortation among British people in their marriage. And it's unbelievably high. The geneticists were all blown away. I was a skeptic of Greg Clark's work. I said, this can't be right because it requires assortivity of 0.6 or 0.7 or something. That's exactly what we measured when we calculated it in the UK Biobank. So he made a very non-trivial empirical observation, which then implied certain things about human behavior at a genetic level. And then those were later verified. So I think as a matter of deep history, someone who really
And
wants
he has a book, he has a specific book?
Multiple books on, yeah, but the best thing is probably this recent, there's a recent paper and the book is not yet out on this. But I can send you a link for your show notes on this.
Yes, and I will definitely call him, because I think it what originated Francis Galton, Heredity of Genius, like the class of how the class preserved throughout history of big, notable British families.
I don't want to throw Clark under the bus to the woke people, but in some sense, Clark is an intellectual descendant of Galton because he's carrying forward Galton's question and doing it in a very systematic, using big data way that Galton couldn't do it. Galton could only look at particular anecdotal stories of specific families like the Darwins or something. But Clark is doing this at a cross-sectional level with hundreds of thousands of people. And he's getting basically results like Galton's results. So it's super important if you want to understand how society works.
Now, this is great. And with the last question, and I promise, this entire discussion is just a hobby of yours, okay? You're a theoretical physicist in a completely different field, which leads me to my last question about productivity, because you maintain a full tenure professorship at the physics department, which we know that has the highest IQ scholars among all university departments. And this entire conversation and this entire startup companies is just a hobby. So please give me like one productivity tip that enable you to achieve such a tremendous goal, or many tremendous goals.
This isn't a very good tip because, unfortunately, as in keeping with the theme of our conversation, this trait might be a little bit hardwired. It might be something just about me, but I really enjoy thinking. So, and von-Neumann used to say this, and other people used to say this, Einstein as well. All these people, not that I'm putting myself in their category, but the habit of liking to think things through permeates my life. So one thing I do often is I take walks. I take long walks where I get away from everything and I'm just thinking and I'm reviewing, like I might be thinking about physics for 30 minutes and I might be thinking about genomics, or I might be thinking about how did Roy pull off that mentalist trick? I just can't figure it out.
And during this walk, do you take notes or just?
No, I don't. I'm actually just thinking in my head. One of the things I found, this is interesting. When I was a kid, my father was a professor of aerospace engineering. And I used to say to my mom, how come dad is so absent-minded, or sometimes he's not paying attention when we're talking to him. And I thought, oh, this is just how he is. This is just how he is as a person. Now, when I was growing up, I was never absent-minded, and I was very socially engaged, and I love talking to people. But my own kids now will say, what's with dad? Dad can be a little spacey. What happens is when you get to the habit of thinking, you get to the point where you can productively work through ideas in your head and do it all the time. So if you get really good at chess, you can probably imagine and analyze chess positions all the time, or come up with new mentalist tricks all the time. And to your kids, it looks like you're a space monster, but really what it is you're a normal person, but you've developed this internal capability so that you can be productive even when you're sitting in a chair or walking in the woods. You can actually kind of do something productive, and that's been very useful for me.
Wow, this was great. Steve Hsu, thank you so much for your time. Again, you were one of the first person or the first callers I wanted on my show, and finally, after 3 years, I got you, and this was one hell of a conversation. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much.
It's been a pleasure, and I actually want to point out, if your audience hasn't noticed already, that you are deeply, deeply read into the literature of all this stuff. So you know what you're talking about. So your audience is very lucky.
Yeah, thank you. I just, by the way, I wanted to write a book about artificial intelligence, and this is a true story. And then I said, okay, but artificial intelligence try to emulate like human intelligence. So I need to write a chapter about human intelligence. And I knew nothing. I knew that there is an IQ, but no one knows this IQ in Israel. But we have the SAT. But by the way, the SAT is not correlated with IQ in Israel, since we have verbal thinking, mathematical thinking, and English as a foreign language. So it throws the SAT of the IQ. So I knew nothing, and I knew that there are many intelligence, and I start reading and reading and reading and reading, and I read everything there is to read about intelligence. Eric Torkheimer is going to be here in 2 weeks, and Robert Plumin is going to be here, and G is for Gene and you. So I just read everything, and as I kept reading, I said, wow, this is the exact opposite of everything I thought intelligence is. And this is why I call this book Intelligence, the Unpleasant Truth, because this is truth, this is unpleasant, and we need to deal with it, because reality is what stays when you choose to escape from all the uncomfortable things.
I agree 100%. It's been great being on your show.
Thank you so much.